We are going to talk about all of the many, many different types of controllers that I have grown up with and have experienced as a gamer. The different ways we've been able to control a video game over the years has evolved dramatically, and it's amazing to see the changes from what we started with as gamers all the way to what we have today. Are starting our journey here from what was pretty much the beginning for me. When I began gaming, it was in the arcades with my father and my brother, and at home we had the Atari 2600, which is basically how we were able to play some of our favorite arcade games ported to the home console at home. And back in the day, in the early 80s, the Atari 2600 was the console to have. Now, this is an updated model right here. So let me bring this closer here to the screen. So I got this particular controller with the Retron 77 made by Hyperkin. They added a second button here so you could be left-handed or right-handed with this controller. And the nice thing is that it's the same exact port as we would use with the original Atari, and it plays all the classic games. So I can actually use this both on the Retron 77 or on my actual Atari 2600. And this is an iconic joystick. This is what I began gaming with back in the day, was having the joystick down on the table and having a single button to work with. And this was how we played pretty much every game, whether we were in the arcade or at home. The arcades, you get the joystick, you'd get a set of buttons. You know, as arcades evolved, there were more and more buttons added. But back in the day, we had primarily a joystick, occasionally a roller ball, depending on the game we were playing. Like, for example, Marble Madness, the arcade game, would have the roller ball, and then later we'd see golf games made, and that was a pretty cool way of playing games. But for the most part, when you think about going to an arcade, you think about a joystick. Whether it was a racing game or a fighting game or an adventure of some sort, it's just, this is how we controlled it. And when video games came home in the form of the Atari 2600, this was the controller that we received. And being people that played in the arcades, we felt at home using this because it felt like being in the arcade. And so many games were ports of our favorite arcade games, like Asteroids and Space Invaders and things like that. So to start off with a joystick made perfect sense to pretty much everyone that was at the beginning of when home gaming became a thing. So when I sit down and use this joystick, I feel perfectly comfortable with it because this is what I started with. This is what I grew up with. And this is what I'm now sharing with my children and showing them how to play these games, where they'll hook up the Atari and play Adventure, or they'll play the original Mario Brothers, or they're playing Atari Bowling and things like that. It is such a nostalgic way to play these games, and I love being able to share this with my kids now and showing a younger generation of what we grew up with. But this was the way to do it back in the day. This was before the Nintendo. This was before D-pads. A joystick was your home for gaming. Now, one of the things I will never forget in my life, I remember it so vividly, the day that my father came home with a Nintendo Entertainment System. And as much as I loved the Atari, and as much as I loved playing it, I think I truly became a gamer when the Nintendo Entertainment System came out. And when this thing entered my home, my life was changed forever. And along with that change was the way I would control these games. And then that's when we got the NES controller. Now, this design, this controller is iconic. This is what many gamers in the 80s and 90s started with. D-pad instead of a joystick. We had our up, down, left, and right. We had a select button, a start button, the B button, and the A button. And this changed the way games felt to play. It was a completely different feel. Instead of holding a joystick, we're using our thumb on a D-pad that, will click. It had a different feel to it. We shifted over to basically having buttons instead of the joystick. So it was definitely a learning curve when it came to playing games. The NES controller is one of my favorite controllers of all time. I love the feel of this controller. I still use it to this day. And a very cool thing that happened along the way was this controller was actually brought back. Cool thing with Nintendo and their Nintendo Switch system is they've created an online service where you can play the iconic games from the NES. And along with bringing those games, they brought back the NES controller. And it is a wireless controller that attaches to the Switch and can charge that way, and it plays wirelessly on the Nintendo Switch. This thing is awesome. And look, we're going to put them side by side. It's the same controller, guys. They brought it back. The feel is great. The way the buttons click, it feels awesome. If you don't have one of these for your Nintendo Switch and you use the Nintendo Switch online service, I highly recommend getting these. The only way to get them is through the Nintendo website directly, through Nintendo.com or NintendoofAmerica.com, whatever it is. But I highly recommend this controller. It feels great. It feels so nostalgic. It just is the best way to play NES games. And when you have iconic games like Super Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong and Metroid and Mega Man, all these games gracing this amazing platform, you want to have the perfect way to play them. And then things started to advance even further as we got into the 16-bit era. Games were advancing as far as graphics, but also their capability of what we could do with the sprites on screen, of what we could do with those characters, how many moves they could have, how many weapons they could handle, what kinds of animations could we have occur on that screen anytime a button input happened by the player. 16-bit era, guys, was a huge time in gaming. That was when the true console war happened between Sega and Nintendo. It was an amazing time in gaming, and to be honest, as much as stressful as I'm sure that was for these gaming companies, us as gamers, us as the players, benefited from it because it forced the companies to put out their best games possible. They were in constant competition with each other, trying to outdo each other. And as we got into this realm of new gaming evolution, the controllers began to change as well. And that's where companies took different directions from each other. So, veering off from Nintendo, we're going to talk a little bit about Sega. And we got something that kind of blew our minds as gamers. And I'm covering it on purpose because we still had the D-pad to work with. But then all of a sudden, it wasn't just two buttons anymore. It wasn't A and B. We got A, B, and C. Now we had three buttons to work with on this system. We had the start button to get things going. Gone was the select button. But we had the C button. And this kind of blew my mind back in the day, seeing this controller for the first time. Even the shape and the design of this controller was incredibly different from the NES controller. And it took some getting used to. But overall, the feel of this controller was pretty comfortable, the way your hand would sit on it. Now, you're going to notice that this controller is wireless. That is because Nintendo, with their online service, plays Sega games, and they made a wireless Sega Genesis controller, which is fantastic. This works great when playing Sega Genesis games on the Nintendo Switch, which is still very weird to say, to be honest, because I grew up in the console wars. But I'm so happy to be able to have this. It feels exactly like the controller I grew up with. It form fits to your hand so much differently than the rectangle of the NES controller. Having the rounded curves here instead of corners was a very different feel. The D-pad even had more flexibility because now there was ways to go diagonal. So you had more control capability and then more buttons to work with. In fact, the Genesis then took it even a step further when they started porting arcade games, and they created the 6-button controller. So you could choose whether or not you were going to use the standard 3 buttons, A, B, and C, or you got the 6-button controller that worked great for games like Street Fighter 2 and other arcade ports where you had the X, Y, and Z button on top. It was great. I have one of those controllers. I don't have it near me, but the 6-button controller was great for a lot of those arcade ports. But for the most part, you could play any Sega Genesis game using this, the 3 buttons here. In fact, some games, like Sonic the Hedgehog, for example, all 3 of the buttons were jump, so it didn't even matter which one you used. But other games, like Revenge of Shinobi, for example, utilize these 3 buttons. You'd get a jump button, you'd get your attack button, and then in many cases the A button would be your special ability. So it was a learning curve as we got into these games. Not only are we learning how to handle 16-bit games versus 8-bit, but now we're figuring out all of these crazy moves. It was very different from playing Super Mario Brothers, where it was just holding B to run and jump with the other button. Now we're jumping, we're moving the character in multiple directions. We're also able to use special attacks as well as a normal attack. It was a very different way of playing video games, but I was all on board and I loved the change. And to be honest, once we got to the 16-bit era, I was a Sega kid growing up. I didn't have a Super Nintendo until I was an adult. We are going to jump over to the Super Nintendo controller. This was the 16-bit era. They needed something to compete with what Sega Genesis put out there with their fancy 3 buttons, and they even had the 6-button controller. But then something joined the world, and it's pretty amazing. Now, I purposely grabbed a different type of controller for this because I really like these a lot. I love these controllers. If you still have your original Super Nintendo controllers, awesome. If they're still in good condition, even better. Continue to use them. They're great controllers. If you're ever looking for a replacement for your original controllers, there are controllers made by this company called Circa. And I believe they do ones for the Sega as well and the NES. But this is their version of a Super Nintendo controller. It has all the buttons represented. It even has the shoulder buttons, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But the thing I love about these Circa controllers is the feel. It feels right. That's the thing. That's the thing about playing these older games and getting into retro gaming. It's the feel of these controllers that are important. Part of the nostalgia is how you feel when you play these games and how it feels to press the button. How squishy is the button? How much does it click? All of that is important when playing these games. And in my opinion, Circa has done a great job with recreating these controllers. It's really a great way to bring back that nostalgia and keep your retro gaming collection alive. It has all the normal connections that are proprietary to the system, and it works even on other systems like I was just mentioning with those Hyperkin systems. So a really great alternative. So using controllers like this that are like remake controllers are fantastic, and they feel great. And the Super Nintendo controller was revolutionary, because not only did it include the 4 buttons here lined up in a comfortable pattern where you're going to be able to control games like Super Mario World and Legend of Zelda Link to the Past very comfortably and use all of your abilities, they also introduced the shoulder buttons. This blew my mind as a kid. Having buttons on the top of the controller, it made holding the controller part of the experience, meaning you had to think about how you were handling this controller. And now, instead of just using your thumbs, hitting these buttons here, the face buttons, you're now using your index finger, or some people use other their middle finger or ring finger, depending on how you're holding the controller, how large your hands are. This was a different way of playing. Now, in the beginning, a lot of games, they would only utilize this for maybe panning the screen over, to the side or something like that. But as games evolved and more abilities came in, these became additional abilities. So now you had your D-pad, you had your 4 face buttons, and you had 2 additional triggers, basically, on the controller for more control over your character, over the sprites on screen. And this is something that became a regular part of gaming controllers going forward. This was a huge difference, especially when we started getting into the realm later on of things like first-person shooters, where now you're dealing with a first-person experience point of view, and these triggers literally acted as triggers. One would be aim, one would be fire, things like that. Later on, we'd get driving games and driving simulators where one shoulder button would be the brake and other was the gas. So these ended up being utilized over time, and for me, it all began on the Super Nintendo when they introduced that on that 16-bit generation console. So this was absolutely amazing and a huge part in the evolution of game controllers. I want to bring up something else before we jump into another console generation. Over the years, all of these consoles back in the day, both 8-bit and 16-bit, they were big on peripherals and accessories and all kinds of different ways and gimmicks to control your games. So it wasn't just game pads. There were all kinds of things to control games. There were literally floor mats you would put down and step on to play games like track and field. There were strange U-Force devices where you just wave your hand over it and it would somehow work. There was the Power Glove. It's so bad. There was every accessory you can think of. But we started getting games, even back in the 8-bit era, where they were basically simulations of some sort, whether it be driving, or maybe it was a shooting game, like Duck Hunt, for example. And with games like that, you would have a different way to control the game, and they would come in the form of a Zapper. The Nintendo Zapper is one of the most iconic gaming accessories of all time. Even just hearing this click, the feel of this trigger and the sound of that clicking brings back so many memories. It's unbelievable. But this type of an accessory was very common in the world of gaming. This thing is definitely had use. It's broken here on the tip. It's actually pretty sharp. But Nintendo had zappers, Sega had zappers, and then we got into the Super Nintendo and they had the Super Scope, and there was all kinds of stuff. So we had alternate ways of controlling our games, not just with a gamepad, a D-pad, a joystick, and some face buttons. We would have simulation styles where we would use a zapper, for example, to have the weapon of the game. So I wanted to bring that up before we jumped into the next generation, because as the generations went on, things like this started to fade away. We'd still get some here and there with like the PS1 era and PS2, but they started to go away and they weren't as popular as they were back in the 8-bit and 16-bit generation. So a very cool accessory, something I still use to this day. My kids love playing Duck Hunt. We try to beat each other's high scores, and it's a ton of fun playing Wild Gunman and all kinds of stuff like that. So I wanted to bring that up before we moved on to the next thing. gaming was evolving. We're getting better and better as players. And as players, we wanted more. We wanted more control over what we could do with these characters and the games that we had placed in our hands. So as we started getting into the 64-bit era, this is where things it was like the Wild West of controllers. The 64-bit era was absolutely insane, not only with the styles of games, but how we were controlling these games. And it seemed like the standards of what a controller was got thrown out the window, and any crazy idea someone had seemed to come to life. And it started fairly simple with some and then became very strange over time. Let's start with the simple. The PlayStation 1 had its own evolution as far as game controllers. When the PS1 originally came out, we were presented with a similar style of controls, but laid out a bit differently. We were introduced to the PlayStation with a controller like this. We had our D-pad with separate buttons this time for each direction. We had our select and start buttons, and we had the face buttons in the form of not letters this time, but we had shapes. So we had the X, the square, the circle, and the triangle. Then, sticking with what the Super Nintendo did, introducing the shoulder buttons, they gave us not just one, not just two, but 4 triggers, this time with the controller, in the forms of L1, R1, L2, and R2. And this created a whole new level of control when it came to playing games, because now we started entering the 3D world of games. We were in 3D space where we could turn 360 degrees around in a game and have way more abilities and more capability of exploring these virtual worlds with these sprites on screen. So the games were becoming more impressive looking, and they were becoming even more impressive to control. Now, this version of controlling a PlayStation was just the beginning, because there was another element about to be added, and it was something that brought back a lot of nostalgia for players in the form of arcade games. Back when we were playing on the Atari and in arcades, we were using joysticks, not D-pads. And even though the D-pad was an advancement, there were some limitations as far as how much control you could have over a character on screen. So there was an alternate form of that being brought to life in the world of controls. But now we were introduced to analog controls. And we got not just one joystick, we got 2 joysticks built into the controller. This started the analog controls, which have now become just a standard staple in the world of gaming. You get any modern day game, you're going to have 2 analog sticks. You're going to have analog sticks to control your games, both for the character movement and for camera controls, because again, we were in the world of 3D games, so we had to spin a camera around to change our view. No longer just side to side, left and right, side scrolling, or even up and down. It was all over the place, and we needed a way to control that. So they introduced analog controls. Now, this was such a huge game changer. And at the time when it was so new, they actually had a button on here to switch back and forth between digital on the D-pad and analog with the sticks, because not every game utilized the analog sticks. But it became a bit of a gimmick for some games, where some games even got re-released as DualShock ready to control with the analog sticks. In fact, these controllers started incorporating vibration within them to bring you more immersed into the game you were playing. The original Resident Evil, for example, had a re-release where the original game only used the D-pad for the tank controls, but now all of a sudden you could use the analog sticks. And over time, more and more games utilized these controls and the capabilities. So it became just more and more advanced as we went. And this type of a controller became somewhat of a standard. This will look very familiar to what we all use currently. But I mentioned before, we were in the 64-bit era of gaming, and that console generation went a little crazy. Sega had one more bout before they got out of the console war or altogether. They decided to throw their hat in the ring one more time during the PS1 and the N64 generation, which we will be taking a look at the N64 in a moment. But I want to show you guys something that it strayed from the norm, but I would say not nearly as extreme as Nintendo did. Along with being an amazing system, in my opinion, the Dreamcast is one of my favorite consoles of all time. This thing was way more powerful than both the PS1 and the N64. It had a higher resolution. It had a crazy amount of power behind it to really outperform both the PS1 and the N64. The problem was this thing wasn't marketed well, and it came at a time very late in that generation where the next generation was right around the corner. So this thing was unfortunately destined to fail. But one of the most memorable things that came from the Dreamcast was the controller. This is a Dreamcast controller. Now notice there's a big hole right there. That was very inappropriate looking, my apologies. There's a big hole right here. And that's for a reason. But let's take a look at the face of this first. One of the things you'll notice is that there's only one analog stick. That's right. We've been introduced to a world of two analog sticks, and suddenly a new system comes out and we have one, which was very interesting. But they made it work. We had the D-pad, we had a start button, we had our 4 face buttons that we started getting used to this layout ever since the Super Nintendo. We also got the shoulder buttons in the form of triggers. Not 4 though, we have 2. So very similar to what Super Nintendo did, except now we have an analog stick. The other thing we have here is this big open space. This was for the sake of the VMUs, the form of memory cards that the Dreamcast used. And these things, I was looking for my VMU. I'm not sure where I put it, so I don't have it here with me at the moment. But the VMU would go into this slot, and there was actually a screen on it. That's why we have a hole here on the face. There was a screen on the VMU. And that would add another level of interactivity and immersion into a video game, because there was actually mini games happening on that screen. Meanwhile, that device primarily acted as a memory card. So you could save your games on there and even play mini games. For example, Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure, introduced these characters called Chows, and these little cute little characters would be in the game. The mini game was about the Chows, and they were very reminiscent of, if you guys remember, from the little watches and the little like Tiger Electronic type things, the Tamagotchis, those types of things. That's what it was reminiscent of. So they built it into these memory cards to be its own little game. In fact, when he took some of the VMUs out, some of the special VMUs included buttons where you could actually play a mini game outside of the controller. It was amazing. I had never seen anything like that with a game console before, and Sega was blowing my mind again with the Dreamcast. Unfortunately, this system did not last. It got blown out of the water by the other big competitors in the form of Nintendo and Sony. And then along the way, Microsoft as well with the original Xbox. So this thing kind of came and went. but it's still one of my favorite systems because I loved how the games played on it. And even though it was a single analog stick, at the time, I was more used to just a D-pad or even a single joystick, so it still felt comfortable for me. This controller itself, if you take a look at the back, has these massive grips. So when you're holding this thing, you're really holding this thing. This thing is a very strange, large control. So it was revolutionary, and it didn't last long. So there's a lot of gamers that aren't even familiar with this and never even held one of these controllers. But if you can get your hands on a Dreamcast, I highly recommend trying it out. There's some really cool games on there. Some were exclusive, others were ports of other games we were familiar with on the PS1 and N64, and guess what? They looked and played better on the Dreamcast. We've brought up the N64 a couple of times. We're talking about the art of a controller going off the rails and being absolutely crazy during the 64-bit era. Well, Nintendo took that level of crazy, well, to the next level. I don't know what Nintendo was thinking. Still to this day, I have no idea what they were thinking when they designed the controller that came out. I'm going to grab two things here. You guys all know what I'm talking about. But for anyone who might not, if you've never played a Nintendo 64, if you've never held a Nintendo 64 controller, you're about to witness something that is just this strange anomaly in the world of gaming, in gaming history. It's something that even to this day, gamers haven't quite figured out how to wrap their brain around this thing. This controller. Nintendo came up with a design that confused everyone. And I'll be honest, I go back and I play Nintendo 64. I still try to figure out what the best way to hold this is, depending on the game I'm playing. Well, let's bring it on screen and take a look at this thing. This is the Nintendo 64 controller. And the first thing you'll notice is the shape. The shape is... It looks like they took a Super Nintendo controller and then added fangs to it. Now it gets weirder. So we're just looking at the face at the moment, right? We have, again, a single analog stick, which actually has an interesting feel to it because it's got like a hexagon here, and it's shaped a little oddly where as you go around, you actually feel it kind of click its way around, which was a little strange. We do have the D-pad, and we have our face buttons. This time we have 6 face buttons, the A and B being primarily the main ones, and then we have these yellow directional buttons, which confused us even further because we've seen controllers with additional buttons where they'd add on to the A, B, and maybe even a C button, and then you have like X, Y, and Z and things like that. These had directions. So technically, we looked at this thing and we're like, why do we have 2 D-pads? It was very, very odd. It confused a lot of players. Now, before we get into how to hold this thing, we're going to turn the controller upright for a moment, and we're going to see we have the trigger buttons, we have the shoulder buttons, we have a left and a right, and then we have an additional port where you can put the memory pack or the rumble pack. But it gets even stranger than that. Let's turn this controller all the way over. There's another button. In the back, in the middle, there's a Z button. And it's a very strange placement, right, for a controller button. Why is there a button on the back? Well, that's where it comes into play of how would you hold this thing. Now, for the sake of holding it and for the sake of the wire not dragging all over the place, I'm going to grab a different form of this. And that is Nintendo, again, wanted to bring some nostalgia back and provide a great way to play these older games on their Nintendo Switch. And they, again, re-released the controller. This is how I originally went to hold this controller and to play. I'm like, okay, left and right side of the controller, thumb on the D-pad, other thumb on the face buttons, index fingers on the triggers. But there's the analog stick in the middle. It's in the middle of the controller. And then there's a button in the back, which I can reach it with like my ring or index finger. You know, I can reach back there and hit this button, but that's awkward. How would I utilize this? What do I go like this? Like that? It doesn't make any sense. But then you find yourself playing a game like Star Fox 64, and you realize, oh, I'm not supposed to hold it like this, like a classic controller. I'm supposed to hold it like this. Holding this like holding the grip of a gun. And the back button has now literally become a trigger. Your thumb on the analog stick, your right hand on the face buttons, and the shoulder button here. But here's another dilemma. What about this one? This controller broke our brains. We couldn't grasp fully how to handle this thing. And still to this day, this controller is infamous. Now, maybe I'm just a fan of torture or something, but I went and bought this from Nintendo because I wanted this iconic feel for the N64 games when playing them on the Nintendo Switch. But still, you go back to these games, play Mario 64, play Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, play Donkey Kong, play, Star Fox. It's figuring out how to hold this throughout the game. So it was a very strange anomaly in the world of gaming that I don't think will ever be matched going forward in the future. This was something that just wasn't repeated. It was a very strange design. I don't know what Nintendo was thinking when they made this, but I will say that as gamers, we all know the N64 controller. Whether we had a Nintendo 64 or not, this thing was infamous. The design that we saw on the PlayStation became very common for future gaming systems. PlayStation kept basically the same design for the next two generations. PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3. We had the DualShock 2 and the DualShock 3. And these were designed just like their original DualShock controller for the PS1. And keeping with this similar design, PlayStation fans were very comfortable going to the next console, moving from a PS1 to a PS2, and then from the PS2 to the PS3. Excuse me. And you'd get the same type of an experience and the same feel with these controllers. Now, they would advance with the different like vibration and DualShock capabilities. This particular controller, the DualShock 3, featured motion controls, and that was a big change in that generation where you could actually tilt this controller and things would happen in the game. Motion controls became a very popular part of gaming, and we saw that huge in the Wii and the Xbox 360. But for the most part, at this point in gaming, this was the standard design for a controller. Now, there is a system we haven't talked about yet that was even back in the PS1 era, and that was the original Xbox. The original Xbox started a different trend of controllers. And back in the day, very similar to the console wars between Sega and Nintendo, the next version of that was basically PlayStation versus Xbox. Nintendo was always kind of the off to the side one. Yes, they were still competing, but Nintendo always did their own thing. So I never truly considered them part of this particular console war in this generation. It was mainly between Sony and Microsoft. And where we would have controllers like this, where you have your face buttons, your D-pad, your two analog sticks, particularly the analog sticks being right next to each other, pretty much centered in the controller for this type of a grip and this type of a feel. Xbox went a bit of a different direction, and they offset their analog sticks. So now we got a bit of a bulkier controller. Again, we have our face buttons, we have 2 analog sticks, a D-pad, we have our shoulder triggers, but the analog sticks are offset from each other. Your left stick for your directional and movement of your character was up higher, while the right analog stick, primarily used for camera controls, is now lower on the controller. And then you can move over diagonally to the face buttons. Now, this particular feel of this controller was very different from the PlayStation. And it was kind of a thing that became part of the debate between gamers of which was better. Which did you prefer? Which did you feel that you had more control of the game over? And there were lots of people that had arguments for this type of a controller with the offset analog sticks versus having the analog sticks right next to each other. And this particular design, I have to say, I've always leaned more towards PlayStation. But depending on the game, I would start to prefer this type of a feel with the offset of the analog sticks. Specifically in first-person shooters. I can't quite explain it, but for some reason, having these offset in this type of a grip fashion, I felt like I had more control when playing an FPS. And to be honest, to this day, I have no idea why that is. And now playing modern first-person shooters, like on the PC, for example, I use an Xbox controller on the computer, and it has the offset analog sticks. And that's how I'll play Modern Warfare 2, or I'll play Fortnite and things like that. I have the offset grip. So even though it was pretty much along the same lines as kind of what the standard that Sony made, they did their own thing and offset the analog sticks, and there are arguments for both depending on what you're a fan of. A very cool entry in the world of controllers. Nintendo kept up with the weird. They wanted to be different. They always have. That was the thing about Nintendo, which that's why I was saying before that I never felt like in this particular generation that I felt like they were in any type of a console war. It wasn't like it was versus Sega. This new generation was between Sony and Xbox, and then Nintendo just kept doing their own thing and finding success. They came up with one of their next generation of consoles, and that was the Nintendo GameCube. The next step into these further just incredible game developments, the insane graphics we were seeing coming to us as gameplay. The games were becoming so cinematic. It was like playing movies by this point. And the Nintendo GameCube not only changed the controller, they changed the discs as well. We were in disc-based games at that point, and we all know what a CD looked like and the size of a CD disc. And then GameCube came out, and the CDs were only this big. Now, these tiny little discs, we didn't know what to do with that. And then along with that change was the continued change of how the controllers were handled. We're going to bring 2 examples up here. Here's an original GameCube controller right here with the wired cord. Nintendo keeping up with keeping these controllers alive with their modern systems, capable of being played on the Switch, the wireless version of the Nintendo GameCube controller. Now, right off the bat, we're going to have these next to each other. You can see they came in multiple colors. It was all kinds of fun of what color controller you can get. But right off the bat, the first thing that you notice is not just the shape, but the button layout as well. This thing, the GameCube controller, is actually one of my favorite controllers, to be honest. It is one of the strangest controllers of all time, but it's one of my favorites. And I'll explain why as we go through it. But you can't help but notice how different it is. This thing went all over the place. We thought the Nintendo 64 controller was weird. In fact, let's bring that back up. let's bring the N64 up here as well, so we can take a look at these things together. So we went from this crazy monstrosity, and everyone's like, whoa, you only have one analog stick? That was a big complaint. They're like, how do you hold this thing? It's like got fangs, and the buttons are all over the place, and I don't know how to play these games with this thing. So there was a lot of complaints when it came to this thing. So Nintendo was like, all right, we need 2 analog sticks. Okay, 2 analog sticks, no problem. The C-Stick replaced the yellow directional buttons. Here's why that is weird. The yellow directional C buttons on the N64 game were not about movement. They were about different abilities and different commands. Things like bringing up a map or an inventory system or using a separate item like an Ocarina of Time, for example. And by making them buttons, it made sense. Because, it's press the up yellow button or the down yellow button to do whatever the command was. It all made sense as a button for what it was used for. GameCube games used the C-Stick in the same fashion, but made it an analog stick instead. Now, think about using an analog stick versus a button. And if you only want to press up, if you're not fully comfortable with it or paying attention, you might go kind of diagonal, or maybe a little too far to the left or right instead of straight up. It was a strange way of utilizing those controls in an analog form versus buttons. Now, they did have games where this would act as camera controls as well, like in other systems would, but this analog stick did not feel like this one. This one we used for movement felt smooth, felt tight, felt correct. This C-Stick is clunky. I think that's the best way to describe it. It's a clunky analog stick. You can hear it clicking. I'm moving an analog stick, and it's clicking. That was a very strange feeling. When the when the Nintendo Switch came out and they made a GameCube style controller for it, they included the C-Stick. And this still has a click, but not as much. They made this smoother. So I will say the best way to play using this controller is actually on the Nintendo Switch. Here's the thing though, Nintendo GameCube games are not on the Switch yet. I heard rumor that they are coming, and that's where this thing will get lots of use. But a lot of people like this controller for games like Smash Brothers, so they made it for the Switch. But here's the other strange thing. We're back to an A and B button, and now we have the X and Y button here in a strange pattern. So we're playing like a Nintendo, like an NES, but then we have these weird side face buttons. They were just oddly placed and oddly shaped. And we have our shoulder buttons, but then there's this Z button here that was awkwardly placed and utilized in strange ways in some games, to the point where I hardly ever use the Z button for any games. And then the other strange thing is the D-pad. The D-pad is tiny. Let's compare the D-pad to the N64. The N64 D-pad was a normal size like we'd have on an NES controller, or really any other controller for that matter. The D-pad on the GameCube controller is tiny and so small that it was difficult to press a single direction. You were practically pressing all of the directions at once, making this D-pad practically useless. Even though I do like the GameCube controller for its overall feel and grip, and for games like Smash Brothers, for example, it's still a very strange choice that Nintendo made. Nintendo was doing their own thing, and they didn't care what everybody else was doing. It was just about what they decided to do and have whatever gimmick it was that they wanted to do at that time. As we got into later generations, we started to stick back to kind of classic controller forms. For example, the PS4 controller stuck with the overall main design. You can see this thing's kind of worn. I used the heck out of this thing. Stuck with the main design from the PS3, PS2, and PS1. But they did bulk up the controller a bit more for the sake of a touchpad. And this is also a button as well. The touchpad was incorporated for different types of controls in some games where there was a little more interactivity with it. Also to play nice with their handheld style, which was introduced with the PlayStation Vita, having a touch screen. So they introduced touch controls that were utilized in some games, but overall not used much. It was more of a gimmick, more of like a buzzword type thing to have incorporated with the games. But for the most part, this controller felt very similar to what we held with the prior entries from the PS3, PS2, and even the PlayStation 1. So PlayStation really found their mold, what they were going to use going forward. We talked about motion control a little bit ago in the DualShock 3 controller. Well, at that time, we had a console called the Nintendo Wii, and it was all about motion controls. And instead of having a standard controller, they provided what was called a Wiimote, which basically was kind of like a stick with buttons on it. And you would hold it in one hand and move it around. There was a little nunchuck controller, and you did all the motion with it based off of a sensor at the end. Nintendo continued in that direction, utilizing motion controls and having something that wasn't held like a classic controller with two hands. They wanted to utilize the ability to have one hand do one thing and the other hand do another. Keep a Pro Controller out for comparison. So here's the Pro Controller for the Nintendo Switch. And we're going to have to grab a couple of things here to take a look at this. Nintendo was big on motion, and they reduced the size of what was known as their Wiimote, and they created Joy-Cons. As you can see, these are separated. They are pretty small when you hold them in hand, and these would attach to the side of the Nintendo Switch, because the Nintendo Switch is also a mobile game. It's got its own screen built into it. Oh, excuse me. It has its own screen built into it, but you can dock the Switch and play it on a TV like any other console. But the strange thing was, when you take these out of the system, now you have this weird little stick that you're holding in your hand with an analog stick and some buttons, and it was just it's a strange way to play. It even has the shoulder buttons. In fact, it gives you a total of 4. So they have everything here for you for playing a game the way most gamers feel comfortable playing it. Except to go along with the gimmicks that are part of the Nintendo Switch, these are all motion based. These can be waved around and do motion controls. They have vibration in them. They sense up and down movement vertically. They sense horizontal movement. These things are pretty darn advanced for what they can do. And they have even sensors on the bottom there so that you can utilize all different types of things and different types of games for like party games and whatever it may be. They even re-released Skyward Sword that came out on the Nintendo Wii, and they put it on the Switch and included the motion controls. But these aren't for everybody. And I don't blame anyone for not being comfortable playing with Joy-Cons, because there's even some games where you can turn it sideways and hold it like you would an NES controller. But I don't have the biggest hands, but these things are tiny. So they're definitely great for kids. It worked great for kids. As an adult, it is hard to use the Joy-Cons by themselves. Well, Nintendo thought of that as well. And they would make things that would adapt the gaming experience. The Nintendo Switch comes with this device. And at first you look at it, you're like, what the heck am I looking at? Is this? It oddly is reminiscent of the N64 design. That was kind of scary when I first took it out. I was like, oh no, we're doing this again? But no, this is actually a holder for the Joy-Cons. And what you do is you slide them into this holder. It clicks into place. And now you have a handheld controller that you can hold with the offset analog sticks, the face buttons, a D-pad, the shoulder triggers, and grips. So Nintendo thought of all of this with this console generation of how to make their gimmick work with every player out there, no matter what you were comfortable playing. And to be honest, I think they did a great job with it between their Pro controller and adapting the Joy-Cons itself. This was a great idea. And even just having the square shape, I thought it would take a long time to get used to it. It's actually fairly comfortable. These particular grips being rounded and as large as they are make this sit comfortably in your hands. So I do really recommend utilizing this accessory to play your Nintendo Switch and to feel more like games from the past and how we would play games. Because I'll tell you, I can't play a game successfully holding two Joy-Cons and trying to play that way. It doesn't feel right. I don't like having my arms separated like that playing it. I need to be with it together and have it, held together like this. So they were able to continue what they were successful with on the Wii and the Wii U in the form of the nunchuck and the Wiimote and adapt it to Joy-Cons and get the same type of experience while advancing the abilities that you had as a player on the console. So a very cool generation of gaming between the PS5, the current Xbox systems, and the Nintendo Switch, where the Nintendo Switch definitely leads the way in innovative designs and trying to be different from their competitions. In the world of motion controllers, the Nintendo Wii was definitely leading the way with it. We had Xbox 360 at the time as well, went to compete by using the Xbox camera and the Kinect. And instead of using a controller, they wanted players to use their own body. That's right. No controller. No controller at all. Wave your hands in front of a camera. Move your legs. Move your body around. And that was the controls. I've played some Kinect games. And some worked. Some definitely worked. But for the most part, that thing was a nightmare to use. What I preferred were the Wiimotes and using a motion controller. Now, the Wii was one thing. That when you think of motion controls, the first thing you think of is the Nintendo Wii. But PlayStation also dove into motion controls, and this is where it started to advance even further. PlayStation introduced their Move controllers. This is a PlayStation Move. And you'll notice that we do have face buttons. We have this funky button in the middle. This was the Move button. And then you can't help but notice this big bulb on the top of the controller. And there's a trigger on the back as well. And you would hold this in either your left or right hand, primarily your right hand, because they also did have a navigation controller as well that was similar to the nunchuck on the Wii. This piece right here on the top, this bulb, would actually light up and it would change colors. It has all the different LEDs inside of it, and it was designed that way on purpose because instead of using a sensor bar like the Nintendo Wii, the PS3 used the PlayStation Eye camera, and the camera would track the light on the top of this Move controller. Now, I bring this up now because this advances even further into what we have in modern day gaming, and we'll get there in just a moment. But the thing about this was the idea of using a camera to track the movement instead of a sensor bar added functionality and advanced the idea of motion controls even further, because now the camera is tracking full movement. Like it could catch movements that a sensor bar would miss. And this actually worked really well with games that were on-rail shooters. They worked with like the dance games, like it was like the Dance Revolution games or whatever those are. It would follow those. They even made exercise games where people were doing like, what is that? Was it called Zumba? I think it was called. Different exercise type games utilizing the motion controller, where you could actually put the controller in your pocket or on your belt, and it would follow your body's movements. The Kinect was the same idea on the Xbox 360, except it was just trying to follow your body itself, not a light. And I think this actually worked better than the Kinect because the camera had something that it was specifically looking for. Why do I mention this now? We have entered virtual reality. And when virtual reality made its way to the PlayStation 4, Sony decided to continue using these Move controllers. And now, utilizing the PS4 camera, which was more advanced than the PSI, that camera would track these Move controllers while also tracking the lights on the VR headset that we were then attaching to our face. We now had motion controls not only in the palm of our hands, we had it attached to our heads. We are stepping into the game and becoming part of the game. Since that came out, we are now up to the PlayStation VR 2, which has a whole new set of controller designs that kind of wraps around your hand, and then you have control where you're holding an analog stick in each hand, and it kind of gives you a grip around the top of your hand. It's pretty crazy. We then have things like the Oculus and all the Meta Quests and all these different virtual reality devices, and that is the hot thing right now. We went from having 3D movies, which was a gimmick for a while and faded, and dove right into VR gaming and augmented reality and everything that brings the player more immersed into the game than ever. But like any game and being a player, you need a way to control it. And now we have things that we have light sensing controllers. We have cameras that are it's just insane what you can do now to control a video game. We became the game. How crazy is that? We went from, where is it? Guys, we started tonight with this. We started with an analog stick and a button. We talked about arcades. We talked about moving into having 2 buttons and a D-pad. And we've made our way all the way to not only holding a controller, but being the controller. We're now in a world where virtual reality exists and can be in your home. That is where the evolution of not only gaming, but the evolution of game controllers has brought us from a joystick and a single button all the way to wearing the game on our face. The evolution of gaming and controllers is one of the most amazing parts of my life. I can't believe what I've experienced growing up. I am so happy that I was there for the beginning of gaming, and where we're at now, I can't even imagine where we're going to be in the world of gaming. If you're new here and haven't clicked that subscribe button yet, and you enjoyed the show, please join the community, click that subscribe button, have some fun with us in all the future live chats, jump into that community tab, join the Discord, we have tons of fun in there as well. And as always, until next time, keep retro gaming alive, because one day your games will be retro too.